Megan, please lead us in our opening song.
Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you. Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Kevin McCluney, and I will be presenting service today along with Tom Edge and Megan Rancier. Lisa Merrill Price and Robin Perry are providing technical assistance. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We're glad that we can keep in touch and support our community, even if we can't be together in person. First, a few important announcements. Please be aware we are recording this service and it will be posted on our Facebook and YouTube pages. Also, we are turning off all mics and cameras for most of the service to minimize distractions and to eliminate feedback from open mics. You will not be able to turn these back on yourself. During hymns, some attendees' mics may be turned on to create our first virtual choir. If you would like to be a part of this group of volunteer singers or would like to perform a song during service, please let us know by emailing Lisa Merrill Price at services@mvuuc.org. During announcements and joys and concerns, you can request to have your mic and camera back on to share by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of the participants window. If you're on a computer, we recommend that you go ahead and show the participants window now by clicking on participants near the bottom of the screen. We recommend you also click on chat near the bottom of the screen so that you may view and send messages to others during the service. If you're on a phone or tablet, however, you should only click on these windows when you need them. Mics and cameras will be restored at the end of the service for the MVUUC coffee hour. If you'd like an order of service, please look in the comments in the chat box or see the email sent out this morning. Now that we have covered those important announcements, we will continue with the service. We joined together this morning to seek justice, equality, and fairness in the world. Our hearts are touched by the human need we feel around us, whether far away or within reach of our hands. We come here to be together, because this is how we believe our lives are best lived, in questioning and in conversation, in compassion and in service, in gratitude and in joy, in companionship and in love. It is good to be together with you this morning. Please take a moment to think of all your friends at MVUUC. Greet them with a comment in the chat box, and remember that you can still reach out to them via email, phone, social media, or video chat. Physical distancing does not need to mean emotional distancing. Let us support one another. Tom, can you ring the bowl for us, please? Thank you. Visitors, as we are a diverse group with varying interests and beliefs, our services are varied in format, tone, and topic. We encourage you to view several services to gain a good understanding of our congregation. If you'd like to receive our weekly email newsletter, please email us at news@mvuuc.org. MVUUC remains committed to supporting our members and friends during this difficult time of social distancing. For that reason, we are coordinating assistance with groceries, phone calls, and other needs. If this sounds like something that would be helpful to you, please send an email to sac@mvuuc.org with your name and what kind of assistance you would like to request. Now is the time for announcements. Announcements can be sent ahead of time to services@mvuuc.org to be read. If you have an important announcement now, you can also raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of the participant box in Zoom. Then we will announce your name and turn on your mic and camera so you can make your announcement yourself. Lisa, are there any announcements today?
No, I don't have any announcements.
Are there any anyone that wants to make an announcement? I'd like to make one now.
I'm not showing any announcements from people either.
Okay, thank you. The chalice will be lit today by Megan Rancier. Please join me in reading the words for the chalice lighting that appear as a comment in the chat box or in the order of service, which is also posted as a comment in the Zoom chat box. The element of fire represents passion, veracity, authenticity, and vitality. If the chalice is the supporting structure of Unitarian Universalism, then we are the flame. We are the flame, fanned strong by our passion for freedom, our yearning for truth-telling, our daring to be authentic with one another, and the vitality we sustain in our meeting together. In all of this, there is love. And now, Megan Rancier will lead us in singing hymn number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People.
We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing for our lives. We are a kind of many colors, and we are singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing for our lives.
Thank you, Megan.
We are gay and straight together, and we are singing for our lives. We are gay and straight together, and we are singing for our lives. We gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our life.
Thank you, Megan. Our opening words come from Kianga Yamada Taylor, an assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. They are taken from her recent op-ed in the New York Times. Of course there are protests. The state is failing Black people. This simultaneous collapse of politics and governance has forced people to take to the streets, to the detriment of their health and the health of others, to demand the most basic necessities of life, including the right to be free of police harassment or murder. What are the alternatives to protest when the state cannot perform its basic tasks and when lawless police officers rarely get even a slap on the wrist for crimes that would result in years of prison for regular citizens? If you cannot attain justice by engaging the system, then you must seek other means of changing it. That's not a wish, it's a premonition. The convergence of these tragic events, a pandemic disproportionately killing Black people, the failure of the state to protect Black people, and Black people being preyed on by the police, has confirmed what most of us already know. If we and those who stand with us do not mobilize in our own defense, then no official entity ever will. Young Black people must endure the contusions caused by rubber bullets or the acid burn of tear gas because government has abandoned us. Black lives matter only because we will make it so. And now, Megan will lead us in singing hymn number 318, We Would Be One. Thank you, Megan. And now we will have a reflection by Tom Edge, Associate Teaching Professor in the School of Culture and Critical Studies at BGSU.
Before I begin, I do just want to give a big thank you to the MVUC board. I was originally scheduled to address the congregation later in June, and I appreciate the fact that they recognized with everything going on right now that we needed to directly address what's happening in our country. So even if it was short notice, I really appreciated their forethought and their desire to really center these issues now when they need to be at the center of our discussion. This morning's reflection was the most difficult for me to write in 4 years that I've been presenting to this congregation. I knew what I wanted to say, and roughly speaking, how I wanted to say it. It was extraordinarily difficult to collect my thoughts, however, as I kept thinking of friends who have been tear gassed in Toledo and Columbus over the last week. It was nearly impossible to keep my composure as I thought of all the people I know and love across the country who have risked their lives in the middle of a pandemic to take to the streets in protest. And I felt myself becoming angrier and angrier as I wondered how many times we will need to have the same exact conversation before substantive changes take place. Now, I want to establish a few things at the beginning of this talk so that there are no misconceptions of what is to come. If you are looking for a speaker who is going to wag his finger at both sides, who is going to plead for nonviolence at all costs, or who will take the stance, I agree with your goals but not your methods, this is not that kind of talk. As a white male who teaches about racism for a living, and who tries to do so from an anti-racist point of view, I'm reaching out to this congregation as an educator. The most important thing I can accomplish here is to help an overwhelmingly white congregation in a county that is 90% white to examine how it can respond to these current protests and the issues they are raising. How they can respond in a spirit of love, support, and justice. But in order to formulate a response that is rooted in our core Unitarian Universalist values, we need to understand clearly what is happening right now. We know the basics. George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a store. When the Minneapolis Police Department responded to the call, one officer threw Floyd to the ground, ignored his complaints that he was in pain and could not breathe, and kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for nearly 9 full minutes, even after he lost consciousness and had died, as other officers stood by and watched. The only reason we know what happened is because a 17-year-old, Darnella Frazier, recorded the encounter and has since given statements against the police officers to the FBI and to local law enforcement. For a week and a half, protests have spread to every state in the Union, not to mention about 20 foreign countries. When incidents like these take place and protests develop, I am often in the position of responding to people's questions about why these supposedly isolated incidents burst forth and grab our attention. In reality, we know that protests are taking place in large part because George Floyd's murder was not an isolated incident. Protesters have used the murder of George Floyd and the understandable anger it has unleashed to highlight the cases of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and others who have not seen charges brought against the police. As we've already learned in the last decade with the rise of entire movements after the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, we cannot predict which cases will capture the public's imagination. Sadly, it is safe to say that when the victim is straight, cisgender, and male, more people pay attention. These protests have highlighted the difficulties in even bringing charges against police, especially in the absence of recordings or other eyewitness testimony. A recent opinion piece in USA Today gave details on the legal concept of qualified immunity and how police are routinely exonerated on charges if there is no court precedent stating that a specific act is illegal or unconstitutional for them. The authors cited several particularly egregious examples. For instance, quote, last November, the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals held that Tennessee cops who allowed their police dog to bite a surrendered suspect did not violate clearly established law. There, the victim cited a case where the same court earlier held that it was unconstitutional for officers to sick their dog on a suspect who had surrendered by lying on the ground with his hands to the side. That was not sufficient, the court reasoned, because the victim had not surrendered by lying down. He had surrendered by sitting on the ground and raising his hands. And in February, the Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals held that a Texas prison guard who pepper sprayed an inmate in his locked cell for no reason did not violate clearly established law, because similar cited cases involved guards who had hit and tased inmates for no reason rather than pepper spraying them for no reason. In both cases, the officers were granted qualified immunity. These sorts of precedents, combined with the tremendous leeway given to law enforcement by the courts in using lethal force, makes it almost impossible to get a conviction against a police officer, especially on charges of murder. A 2019 study by NBC News stated, quote, since 2005, 98 non-federal law enforcement officers have been arrested in connection with fatal on-duty shootings, according to the Police Integrity Research Group's data. To date, only 35 of these officers have been convicted of a crime, often a lesser offense, such as manslaughter or negligent homicide, rather than murder. Only 3 officers have been convicted of murder during this period and seen their convictions stand. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor reminded us in our opening words today, when a system repeatedly fails you, it leaves no choice but to protest. And make no mistake, Black activists and their allies have been working within the system to try to create positive changes. This is not simply a reality of our own time period or of the era of the Black Lives Matter movement. Attorneys, activists, civil rights organizations, legislators, grassroots organizers, people have been working nonviolently around these issues for generations. Now, if that work has been continuous, and if these critiques of racism and policing stretching back at least to the 19th century, why do the majority of white people only care when the protests become violent? Earlier this week in an online exchange, I asked a stranger to consider a different form of that question. Instead of thinking, why are they protesting violently, I asked her to think, what is your breaking point? What would it take for you to resort to violence? Many of us have said we would die protecting our families or our country from attack. What does it take to push entire communities to the breaking point like this? This kind of focus also keeps our attention on the immediate issues at hand. In the aftermath of the Baltimore protests several years ago, following the killing of Freddie Gray by the police, some people paid much more attention to the burning of a CVS than to asking why Mr. Gray's spinal cord was nearly severed in two. In 2020, we need to be less obsessed with the looting of a Target store and more concerned with the targeting of Black and brown bodies by police. Now, in the interest of time, I am not getting into the debates here over who is most responsible for violence, as people look at protesters themselves, outside agitators, white supremacists, anti-fascist organizers, and so forth. As journalist Wesley Lowery has pointed out in the last 2 weeks, it is possible for all of those groups to be involved at the same time. But from the first protests in city after city, the common thread is that police show up ready for a battle. A few weeks ago, when white protesters with guns demanded the reopening of America's public spaces and a return to business as usual, the police who showed up for these protests were usually in their regular uniforms with standard issue weapons. When protesters are protesting the police, SWAT teams show up in full riot gear with heavy weaponry. From the Occupy movement to the present, this response from police has been studied extensively and is found to have the effect of triggering violence at protests. With this connection well established, we need to ask serious questions about why armed, white, conservative protesters are given the benefit of the doubt as police make decisions on how to respond, while people of color and their allies are not. Amid the concerns over violence at these protests, one troubling undercurrent that I continue to hear is that people want to go back to a nonviolent time before the murder of George Floyd. Protesters have been asking quite pointedly, when have we been a nonviolent society? Does violence only count when it comes from protesters? Can we call ourselves nonviolent when 1,000 people per year are killed by law enforcement? Can we call ourselves nonviolent when we tolerate homelessness, food insecurity, and extreme poverty? Can we call ourselves nonviolent when we deny medical care in the middle of a pandemic? Can we call ourselves nonviolent when the state routinely uses violence to solve its own problems, both at home and across the globe? I do genuinely understand those who are concerned of how violence will affect the protesters themselves, or how it will affect other marginalized communities. This week, the beating of a Black trans woman, Ayanna Dior, by a group of Black men went viral, highlighting how some people are using the current crisis to further their attacks on those who face multiple oppressions at once. Likewise, for very selfish reasons, I was happy that the people I know and love in this community were unharmed last Sunday during the protests that took place in Bowling Green. But I would like to challenge this congregation to look beyond the optics of these protests and think about the goals. Here in Bowling Green, members of the police joined last Sunday's protest, and many in the community applauded their support. But others did not attend because they did not feel safe standing side by side with the police department at a rally about police violence. They are far more interested in where police stand, not whether they kneel. If an officer joins protesters one day and tear gasses them the next, that is not allyship. If an officer speaks out against the murder of George Floyd, but does not feel comfortable speaking out if they see abuses within their own department, that is not allyship. If an officer takes a class on implicit bias and is still more likely to stop a Black motorist on Worcester Street, that is not allyship. And as we saw last week, if some police unions condemn the officers who killed George Floyd, while other police unions describe Floyd as a, quote, violent criminal to justify his death, that is not allyship. At some point, our community here in Northwest Ohio needs to move beyond the performance of grief and into the very real actions of confronting systemic racism directly. We have gathered and mourned on that same spot when the rights of immigrants were being attacked, when a gunman murdered 50 people in a queer nightclub in Orlando, and when a white supremacist murdered 9 Black people at a church in Charleston. Now, what are we doing to change conditions here and across the country? Fortunately, I've been encouraged over the last 10 days to see many white people taking constructive, tangible steps. I've been approached by so many people seeking resources to educate themselves as a starting point for action. There are a lot of lists circulating with suggested resources, and I am happy to point people in the right direction. If you're at this stage and trying to learn more, my primary advice is this: diversify your sources. Do not rely solely upon white experts to learn about racism. Yes, given what I do for a living, I appreciate the irony of that statement. But when I teach classes on African American history and culture, the vast majority of the readings assigned are from Black authors. If we are open to the truth about systemic racism in America, we should be open to hearing those truths from the people directly affected. I've also noticed a big push to donate to causes related to the protests. Again, I cannot stress what this means to protesters on the front lines, whether you are giving to bail funds in cities across the country, or to grassroots organizers who are trying to empower communities from the ground up. Consider making this a regular monthly donation, because we need to continue building and supporting an infrastructure that will keep the momentum moving forward, even if the large-scale protests fade away. A few weeks ago, when I talked to this congregation about the new normal that would emerge after the COVID-19 pandemic ends, I spoke about our aspirational goals as a congregation, as a larger faith community, and as a society. We must do the same when it comes to policing. Some people have started with the 8 Can't Wait campaign, pointing to 8 policies law enforcement agencies can enact to help reduce the likelihood of violent encounters. But critics fear that these may result in more money being invested into policing, including the expansion of technologies for police surveillance and for non-lethal uses of force. Combined with the previous issues I mentioned with regard to qualified immunity, activists raise serious questions of whether these de-escalation policies would be adequately enforced. Thus, in the same spirit I invoked about our responses to the pandemic, let's challenge ourselves to think bigger. More and more people are seriously listening to the voices of Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Jordan Camp, Alex Vitale, Miriam Kaba, and others who have pushed us to think of alternatives to traditional policing and prisons. I would like to stress that the most important and influential voices on this front have tended to be Black feminists, Black women who feel that they have in particular been failed by this current system and that their concerns are usually ignored. In putting forth police and prison abolition, these activists ask us to focus on 3 key ideas. First, they raise important questions about the nature of policing and justice. Many critiques of our criminal justice system focus on how it emphasizes punishment rather than rehabilitation. Abolitionists encourage us to think of other community-centered means of dealing with crime. We need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to truly take responsibility for what you have done to the community? What part can you play in restorative justice, in taking positive steps to correct your actions and make it up to the people you have harmed? How can we teach people to take that sort of responsibility while preparing them to be full and equal members of society again? When post-sentencing restrictions are, post-sentencing restrictions are preventing people from truly re-entering society? If our prison and court systems have not adequately progressed on these issues over the last 2 centuries, it is time to seriously consider alternatives. Secondly, abolitionists point out that police are not adequately trained to deal with many of the issues we thrust upon them. This is not a simple matter of increasing the amount of training they receive, although that issue has been raised in the current debates around law enforcement. Rather, it questions why we see the police as the first people who should respond to issues that are not actually related to law enforcement. For instance, abolitionists feel that instead of calling police when someone is having a mental health crisis, we need mental health professionals on call who can respond. While we certainly have work to do when it comes to mental health and identity, including race, abolitionists hope that by reducing the number and types of encounters between police and civilians, you will decrease instances of police violence. Moreover, when it comes to mental health, addiction, and other social issues, it emphasizes the short and long-term needs of the people rather than punishment. Thirdly, abolitionists point to the roughly $200 billion in local and state taxes that support criminal justice systems across the country. Beyond using some of that money to hire other types of professionals to deal with community issues, they also push us to invest that money in programs that decrease the likelihood of crimes. Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman point out that the United States spends more than twice as much on police, prisons, and courts as it does on cash welfare programs. This week, Luke Darby published an article examining how major cities invest in policing to the detriment of anti-poverty and anti-crime initiatives. In Los Angeles, prior to suggestions this week that the budget numbers may change, spending on economic development for next year was scheduled to be $30 million. Spending on the police, $3.14 billion. New York City's $5 billion policing budget, that is B, billion. New York City's $5 billion policing budget is more than its combined spending on the departments of health, homeless services, housing preservation and development, and youth and community development. Minneapolis, of course, has been at the center of our attention this week. In 2020, its budget poured $193 million into policing, $400,000 into the Office of Crime Prevention, and $250,000 into organizations working with at-risk youth. People on all sides of politics have argued for cuts in spending to other programs that they see as ineffective or wasteful. Why shouldn't we ask whether the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on law enforcement would better help our communities if it went to housing, healthcare, education, and restorative justice? If this seems like a radical solution, well, it is. It's not the only proposal being discussed right now, but it does ask us to think about the root causes of crime in our country and the conditions in which people live. Abolition asks us to start our analysis with the needs of our communities, with our vision of what community really means, and develop policies from there. Whatever path we choose, however, we need to take real action, and soon. This summer will mark 57 years since Dr. King warned us of the fierce urgency of now. He tried to warn America that if it did not listen to the voices crying for justice, there would be a rude awakening when white America tried to return, to business as usual. If we truly want to create a society rooted in peace, we need to listen to that call once again and realize that our time has run out. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. A core value shared among UUs is the importance of justice, equity, and the inherent dignity and worth of every person. That means that no life should be worth less than any other. Moreover, justice is so important to UUs that the word actually appears in 2 of our principles. UUs have long shown a commitment to these values, from marching for civil rights in the 60s, to the official support of Black Lives Matter by the UUA in 2015, to the present actions of many in our congregation and UU community. I encourage us all to think deeply, question our biases, we all have them, then learn and act. Our offertory today will be a little different. It will go to Campaign 0, which is working to end police violence.
Our closing words today come from 20th century activist and organizer Ella Baker. Until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens.
So now it is time for extinguishing the chalice. Please join me in reading the words for extinguishing our chalice that can be found in the comments in the chat box or in the order of service. We extinguish this flame, but we keep its light in our hearts, with its message of love and justice, taking it outside these walls to the world we live in, until we are together again. Thank you. After the service, we'll return on all videos and mics. Feel free to stay in Zoom and chat with your fellow MVUUC members and friends for our coffee hour. Please be patient, as turning on the cameras must be done one at a time, and it can take a few minutes to get to everyone. And now for our closing song, let us sing Spirit of Life. You can find the words as a comment in the Zoom chat box or in the order of service.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart,
The sea,
giving life.
Thank you, Megan. That is the end of service, but please stay for the virtual coffee hour that follows. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.